Hi, everyone. Thank you for that introduction, Atish. As he mentioned, my name is David Hughes, and I work at Graphable.ai. I want to start by thanking you for joining me today and to thank Neo4j for inviting me to present. Today, we're going to explore how to accelerate the time to value proposition that every new project must address. And that's critical because when a project starts, so does that clock that begins the countdown by which a developer, the business, and or all the stakeholders have to demonstrate value from starting the project in the first place. And that's what is going to be the underlying theme to what we talk about today. So by the end of this presentation, I hope you walk away with an understanding of how to rapidly demonstrate value and valuable insights for various audience through the rapid application development using a framework called Streamlit for rapid application development. And of course, the graph database in Neo4j. And I think the best way to do this is we're going to attempt in 30 minutes at a high level to rapid application develop a clinical application that sits on top of a graph database. So for some context, Graphable was working on a project for a big pharma company, and we had built a knowledge graph for them and it was focused around proteomic research. They were looking at developing biomarker tests and as well as some new interventional drugs. The client approached us and asked, could we bring in a new data source beyond what had been originally scoped, and then also create a custom application that was something more familiar to the various stakeholders at the company, because the company had three key objectives they wanted this new application to serve, and it was addressing multiple audiences. The objectives were, could we look at the knowledge graph and this new data source and try and map patients to a clinical trial? Could we look at a clinical trial and determine what might be a good clinical trial site for this company to partner with? And then also, what clinical trials were out there where maybe this biomarker or a new drug would be applicable to exploring? So for a little bit more context, the new data source that the client asked us to bring in was clinical trials around a neurodegenerative disease called ALS. And we knew that we could bring in this new data source because we were using the Hughes platform from GraphAware. It is a Hughes graph, or it is a graph insights engine. One component of it is something called Orchestra, which is very good at rapidly bringing in and integrating in data into graph projects. So the key focus for us is we wanted to leverage that Hughes platform to allow us to have the most amount of time to focus on developing the application that the client had asked us to develop. Let's take a look at what we're going to build. These are just two screenshots from components in the application. This is on the left a data grid, and you can see that it exposes the ID for a clinical trial that's called the NCT ID, stands for National Clinical Trial ID, and the brief title of each of the clinical trials. Now on the right is an interactive map, and we're going to take a look at that and just see how interactive it is later in the presentation. But it's an interactive map that shows the location of each of those clinical trials on the left. One of the ways that Streamlit really excels is just how easy it is to connect data components to visualization components. The entire code for developing these two components, and of course, all of the layout around it, is about 56 lines of code. So this is what I'm really excited to get into and show you.
Excuse me, David.
Yes.
Your screen is not sharing. Could you share a screen, please?
Oh, one moment. Can you see that?
Yep. Thank you, David.
Absolutely. Sorry about that. I didn't realize the screen sharing had stopped. So again, this is what we're looking at is the two components, and we're going to emphasize one of the capabilities of Streamlit is just how easy it is to connect data components to visualization components. Let's go ahead and think about and talk about the clinical trial data that we're going to bring in. And the client had asked us specifically, as I mentioned, to focus in on clinical trials for ALS. So we should probably look at what is ALS. ALS is a progressive neurodegenerative disease. It affects the brain cells, the nerve cells of the brain and of the spinal cord. And the patients in the journey of ALS start with the beginning to lose or the loss of motor movement, and progressively they are unable to speak, eat, and ultimately to breathe. And it's a very difficult disease. So we had, as I mentioned, been in the process of developing the knowledge graph around proteomics. Here in the center of this very complex schema, and I apologize that it's maybe a little small for you viewers, that we have a protein and all of the concepts around a protein, things like genes that express those proteins, biological processes, and molecular functions. But what we were interested in is, if we're going to bring in the clinical trials data, how do we integrate it into this complex proteomic and genomic knowledge graph? And what we decided to zero in on was drugs, because clinical trials, they come in different modes or flavors. You can have a clinical trial that is looking at, let's say, a medical device and looking at the efficacy of that device, or behavioral modification. Well, since we were working for a pharma client, and one that was focused on developing new drugs, it made sense that we only look at those trials for ALS that had an intervention type of a drug. And we knew that in our existing schema, we had two properties on the drug node that we had modeled that might be good opportunities for us to tie in the data to, and that is that generic name or the product name. Now, it would have been nice, of course, if the clinical trials gave us something like the NDC product code, but that wasn't available. And so we knew we only had two capabilities to potentially tie in this data source into our existing knowledge graph. And we'll look at see how successful we are with that. Now, the data source is ClinicalTrials.gov. It is a rich database of both private and publicly funded clinical trials that are conducted all over the world. And it's provided by the U.S. Library, National Library of Medicine, and they have a really robust and rich API. I enjoyed using it, and the opportunity, I think, though, for improving the way that we store and make clinical trials available is how we put that data into the system. You'll see that the data is put in very large text fields that aren't very discrete. And of course, when you call an API, that's how the data got in. Of course, that's how you're going to get the data out. So we're going to see that we have some challenges about the way this data is coming back and how we manage them and then optimize on those using the interface that we're going to build in Streamlit. Now, one thing I should tell you, and I think that this is something else that highlights the value of Streamlit, is that from start to finish, we received the request from this client as I was boarding a flight in Tampa, Florida. Could you make this custom application? Because we really want to get into the data and start exploring it, and we don't want to wait for a full development of a production-ready environment and UI. And that's something that was happening concurrently. So during a 6-hour flight from Tampa, Florida, I was able to orchestrate the data using the Hughes platform, research and learn how to use the API, but most importantly, I was able to develop a custom application using Streamlit by the time I landed in Seattle, and was able to join a Zoom call still at the airport and then demonstrate this application to the client. Of course, it went through some iterations after that, but that is the key here is that rapid application development using Streamlit really gives you the capability to provide value and demonstrate that time to value proposition. Let's take a look at one of those queries. This is an example of a query. What I'm going to do is I'm going to see how well the lag is here on this presentation, and let's switch over to the ClinicalTrials.gov API. I hope that you're seeing this interface now from ClinicalTrials.gov. Here is an example of their query language. We're going to look for trials that are subject to ALS. That's ALS spelled out there on the left right here. And we're specifically going to look for trials that are being conducted in the United States. We're really interested in just those that are actively recruiting new patients. And so we put this here. And then we really, as I mentioned before, need trials where the intervention type is of type drug, because that's how we're going to integrate this back into the existing knowledge graph. So let's send that query and see what we get back. And sure enough, it comes back pretty responsively. Now, what I want to do here is look at the criteria components in this return. This also may be a little small, but I think you can get the impression that it's one big block of text. Criteria are these very atomic sort of things, like you have to be a certain age, you can't have taken this medication before, and these are very discrete items. This big blob of text is not very discrete at all. And so here's where we're in Hume, we're going to leverage the ability to do some natural language processing, as well as rely on the good old standby of regular expressions. And this is one of the things that we really enjoy about Neo4j, is because we're going to be able to take advantage of the ability to run graph data science algorithms actually in the database and in memory where the data is stored. And that's just a hugely powerful capability. So this is an example of the UI and the return that we get back from running this query. So I'm back on my slides now, and hopefully you're still with me on that. So we looked at this as an example of that very non-discrete data return that we got. And we then had to think about, okay, we have an existing Neo4j knowledge graph, and we're very happy with Neo4j. This is, as I mentioned, full of the capabilities that we enjoy presenting to clients, as well as that graph data science, that GDS capability I'm sure you've heard about in other presentations today and maybe tomorrow. It's just an amazing accelerator to any project. But then there is that concept of graph ops. And by graph ops, I mean how to orchestrate from the beginning life cycle all the way to the end of taking data, finding it, pulling it in, maybe doing some pre-processing to it, and then loading it into a graph database. And then going in additional steps of enriching and augmenting your data in a graph database through other workflows that you may have. And so we looked at, sort of things like the Kafka and or Spark connectors. We use and leverage those often. There's tools like the Neo4j admin tool, there's Python SDKs, but we, as I mentioned, use Hume not only because of its ability to facilitate graph operations, but also because it provides a single pane of glass to being able to visualize those results of that. Here, of course, the client had envisioned seeing their data scientists use that visualization capability, but they also wanted the custom app so that other users and stakeholders could use a familiar interface that they could then leverage to achieve their objectives. We also looked at Apache Hop as well as Apache Spark. Now, this is an example of a workflow in Hume. It's probably very small, so I think the best way to look at this and maybe get a flavor for what it can do is let's jump over to that interface. Now, this is the workflow, and we'll run it. It only takes a couple of seconds, and this is part of that entire project lifecycle. If you're going to build a rapid application using Streamlit, well, you have to have some data in a graph database in which to do that. So let's go over to the database. Here we're going to use the database that I created called Trials Demo. I want to show you that it is empty, so I just ran this query that matched and returned the count of all nodes, and sure enough, it is 0. And now we're going to switch over. Hopefully, my screen is still showing. Adhish, can you confirm that you can still see my screen?
Yes, your screen is showing perfectly.
Thank you. I just saw some text come up on the chat. So this is the live workflow in the Hume orchestra. And we are going to now run this. And what it's going to do while we're running it is it's going to make that API call, get the trials. It's going to do some pre-processing over those trials. Once it retrieves those, it's going to batch those up for rapid processing. We're going to write some of the initial trial data to Neo4j using Cypher query blocks. And then in parallel, we're going to create those other components of the schema that we're interested in, which are those inclusion and exclusion criteria, as well as some other properties of the clinical trial. And then this will all shut down when it's completed. So let's go ahead and run this. And if the demo gods are with me, hopefully this will run. This is always a challenge when you get timeouts. Okay, let's try this one more time. And if not, we can go back to the slides. Okay, here we go. Everything's zeroed out. It's now running. It's grabbed all the trials for ALS. It's pre-processing those. It's writing the initial data in parallel. It's writing all of the other components. And then now we're stopped. That's great. So with just a little bit of visual programming here and adding in some configurations in some of these blocks, we were able to run this orchestration. And down here in our error handling, we see that we didn't get any errors. Let's go back and take a look. And sure enough, over here, now we have data in our database. Probably not a lot because ALS is a more rare disease for neurodegenerative diseases, but we can see that we actually have our clinical trial data now loaded and can start working with it. And you can see that we have some properties like the summary, the title, and other aspects of the data. Now, and then because I had to refresh, let's go and look at this. We have a schema. It's very basic. It's the clinical trial and some of the components that I talked about. But let's take a look at least one instance of a clinical trial. Here we can see the NCT ID for a clinical trial. We can see some of these inclusion criteria about whether or not the patients meet a certain age or not. There's two interventions. One's a placebo and one is this new interventional investigational drug. So that's why it has that kind of a name. And then we can see it has multiple sites at which this trial is being conducted, as well as we can see some of the exclusion criteria for which patients would be denied entering into this trial. All right, let's go back to the slides. Now, this is the Hughes orchestration. As I mentioned, there were some other options to us. This is the similar orchestration built in Apache Hop, but just to show you that there's more than one ways to get data into a database that you're going to build a Streamlit app on. We're really pleased with all of the features and capabilities of Hughes, but there are other ways to accomplish that. This is the criteria and the instance that we just looked at. So we've been talking now, I think, for almost a third of the presentation, and we still haven't discussed, well, what is Streamlit, other than, I gave you a brief description that it has something to do with rapid development of applications. Let's get into that. So Streamlit is a framework for developing better applications rapidly than maybe you would have to try and attempt to do using some other approaches. I think in short, one of the best descriptions I've seen is this second bullet that says it allows you to take data scripts and make them into shareable apps literally in minutes. For me, that's 6 hours. There was a lot of learning the API and looking and orchestrating the data and doing some other work. But still, even in 6 hours that I had something I could show a client is pretty powerful. The other component of Streamlit to be aware of is that it's pure Python. You don't need any front-end experience. You don't need to know React. For you functional programmers out there, if you know Elm, it's pretty good, but this is pure Python for just rapid development. Now, I recently had to learn TypeScript, and I've been extremely impressed with what goes into making a production-ready application with just an amazing UI. But while that kind of a project is occurring, you still want to be able to demonstrate value as rapidly as possible so that your client can stay on that cutting edge and obtain that first mover advantage to working with the data and achieving whatever their objective is. Here, we'll talk about what capability Streamlit allowed and how our client was empowered to try and pursue the objectives of matching patients and finding clinical trial sites for their companion test and biomarkers, as well as the drugs that they were developing. Now, Streamlit has some amazing features, I think. One of them is the helpful decorators that it has for very concisely allowing you to integrate functions and codes into rendered UI. It has what I think is just a near real-time blazing interaction loop and iteration loop, and we're going to see that here in a second. And then it comes with some core components that does all the things you would want an application development framework to be able to do. Things like charting, control flow, data management, and of course there's forms in all the input fields, but state management, being able to manage between user sessions as well as reruns of the application. It's just really a powerful capability, and to be able to do it as concisely as Streamlit can, I think that you'll see here momentarily that it's really an impressive framework, and it does so much more. Now, as far as components go, there are core components. One of the things we'll see here in a second is also community developed components. Community developed components just really speak to the extensibility of the framework as well. Now, one of the areas that these frameworks like Dash and some of these others really struggle, and frankly, so did Streamlit up until about June of this year, is the ability to develop an application that has multiple pages or views, known as single page applications or spots. So in June, Streamlit released what I think is just a really creative solution to that. Before, there had been some hacks and some workarounds, and I certainly leveraged those. But now, just by the structure of the project directory, you can create pages and use prefixes with numbers that create the hierarchical navigation, and we'll see this exposed as a side navigation bar, as well as being able to manage the Python code that represents a unique view into your data. So that is a welcomed advance in Streamlit. Now, here's the part where we start looking at some code, and we're going to slide over to my editor here in a second. Let's go ahead and do that now. And I'll wait for a second or two for everyone to catch up to me, because sometimes there's lag. Hopefully you're looking at my VS Code editor now. And what we are looking at is the code necessary to create the home screen for this application. It has a logo, some text, and a title. You'll note here that I'm using Markdown, which is just great, so that I can actually additionally add layout and some properties to my visualization just by using Markdown, because Streamlit allows me to implement not only plain text, but Markdown in my code. But I think a good example of the conciseness of Streamlit's rendering capabilities is the columns. So here I'm using ST columns to create 2-column layout in my home page. And I've passed it 2 values in this list, saying that I want 2 equally sized columns. I could have made the second one a 2, and then now I'd have had a bigger column on the right. But what I get back from that function is 2 variables that I can then use to demarcate what's going to be in each of those columns. And again, I leverage Markdown and am able to use that to then render what I have. So let's actually run this. And again, with the demo gods on my side, this will all work. We'll start this up, and here we are. This is how fast it looked at that code and rendered the home page. And you can see these 2 columns. Using Markdown, I had bold headers on top of each of those, and then I had a list in each of those. And I even get the ability to quickly have links I can copy. And all of these things kind of come for free with just that 1 line of code to create these columns. This entire page is less than 52 lines of code, so pretty impressive. Now, what I want to show is, let's go back to the editor, and let's make a change. The title is Clinical Trials. Let's make that Clinical Trials at Nodes. It might help if I can spell better. Nodes22. And I'm going to save that. And let's go take a look. I'll wait for everyone to catch up to my screen sliding here and see what we got. Well, wait a minute. Clinical Trials. There's no at Nodes22. And so you might be scratching your head right now and going, I'm not really impressed with that blazing fast iteration that you told me about. And that's because here, the first time you run a Streamlit application, you have to tell it you want that iterative capability. So now you see that at Nodes22. That's great, but it really didn't impress me that seemed very rapid. So let's go back to the code, and let's get rid of that at Nodes22. And again, I apologize for the rapid screen sliding, but I'm going to hit save. And now you can see by the time this renders on your screens that the at Nodes22 is gone. I actually have a progress bar that shows any changes, and it just happens so quick you just never even see it. Now, some of the other capabilities that we'll quickly go through here is clinical trials. This is now reading from the Neo4j graph database. Here is that nice component where we can get in and filter some of the clinical trials or whatever data you're looking at quickly. I can even create a pivot table view of my data, but I can also come over here and then look at the actual data for a single clinical trial. And again, with about 50 lines of code, I've laid this out where I'm looking at the different components and discrete data, as well as I was able to create these expanders that allows me to look at inclusion and exclusion criteria. And here we can see the fruit of using the regular expressions in NLP in Hume and in Neo4j to pull out from that big blob of text the actual exclusion criteria for this particular clinical trial. While we're here, I'm going to go ahead and highlight this drug for this particular clinical trial. And let's go down to what was built in the drug sites capability. Before we do, though, take a look at the functionality here. There's these two expanders, and we have layout. And let's just go over to the code. That was the clinical trial site file. And you can see in my mini map just how concise the code is that rendered not only the columns, but the expanders, the layout that they were on the right-hand side, and some other capability that we're about to see. So here's our clinical trial. Let's go back to clinical trial sites. I now have the data grid, and this data grid is pulling in from the database, but with only one line of code, I was able to connect this data grid to an interactive map. Here, I can zoom in and look at in very good detail where clinical trials are occurring. There's some other functionality that could be explored there as well. But if I come back here and I look at the clinical trials, we can come in and select one of these clinical trials. And let's find one that actually has some trials here in North America. And here we go. So we're able to filter, because of that one line of connection between the components, and visualize in the interactive map the trials sites where this particular trial is being conducted, and it's being conducted at quite a few. We can also go and using that drug that I copied over from the other section, let's find all the trials that are using this particular interventional drug. And here we can see that there are trial sites in Arkansas, Georgia, Texas, and Minneapolis, all because of one line of code that connects both a data component to that visualization. Just again, highlighting the conciseness and just the features of Streamlit. Also, we did build in the capability to look at matching, because the client had asked patients potentially to trials. And so here, again, in just a few lines of code, we were able to start selecting different criteria and then submit that and find trials. Lastly, what I'll show here is we then used graph algorithms in Neo4j and calculated the page rank for each of the clinical trial sites. And that gave our client the capability to start thinking about two things. One, what clinical sites would be good opportunities for an interventional drug that had a mechanism of action and that were highly ranked. And this is the capability of the knowledge graph, and that it had those properties as nodes, and the fact that we ran this algorithm and could show them the rank order. So now they can find good partners for conducting their clinical trials, as well as getting some insights to where might there be researchers and clinicians who are able to conduct a trial and are familiar with the interventional drugs and or similar drugs based on mechanism of action that they might be interested in. All of this, again, just on a 6-hour plane flight and giving our client the capability that they were looking for. Now, I'll pause for a moment and say that I do have a much more in-depth blog article. The link will be here at the end of my presentation. And in this blog article, not only do I go over a lot of what we're talking about in this presentation, but for those of you who are really want to walk through how to install Streamlit and how to start building some of these components, this blog article will be a good primer for you. So I do recommend that you go to graphical.ai in the blog site and take a look at not only this blog, but maybe some of the other things that we're doing as well. We're going to jump back to the presentation. And I talked about some of the other code efficiency capabilities. One of them is these decorators. This is one called Streamlit Cache, which when you run a function, if you configure it using Streamlit Cache appropriately, it'll only run the first time it's called. But if any of your other pages or reruns of those pages occur, it'll pull the rendered results out of cache, which just really is lightning fast for the end user experience. Also, we talked about some of the capabilities of these components, and we went through those live. But the last thing I really want to emphasize here is these are very modular components that in very concise and brief code, you can compose together, you can connect them, and you can expose some interactivity that should delight most stakeholders. And then, like I said, give them the ability to rapidly move on a new data source that you've integrated into your project while maybe a more production-ready effort is occurring. But this gives them that capability to get ahead of the game compared to other businesses who might be also looking at that same capability. So we've moved pretty fast. And in this Streamlit tutorial, we've explored how to rapidly produce that value, really accelerating the time to value proposition that I think any of us are familiar with in any new project. And we've also looked at how Neo4j is just an exceptional partner to Streamlit for being able to marry the two together and really surface insights for various audiences like businesses, data scientists, and people like a proteomic and or biomarker developer. So the link for the blog post that I talked about is here. And again, this will be in the recording, but feel free to take a quick screenshot if you like. And then lastly, the one thing I want to say is I'm excited about graphs. I love graphs. And here at Graphable, I get the opportunity to do that every single day. So if you are working on a graph project at your company or just on your own, and you want to talk about it, if you want to get into some Streamlit and maybe do some pair programming, then I'm the person to contact. I'd be happy to get in there and talk to you about it. Here's my contact information at Graphable. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I look forward to hearing any questions you may have. Thank you. And if you have any additional questions, just put them in the chat and I'll answer them after this presentation. Adhish, are we still live? And do we have any questions in the chat? Okay, great.
Yes, we do.
Okay. Let's see. And I need to try and find the questions. Right now I'm in private chat. Adhish, can you tell me where to look at the questions? Ah, great. Yeah, so since the question that we have is, does Streamlit work with GraphQL? Well, since its underlying component is Python, is what's foundational to it. One of the things I didn't show you is I had some other Python scripts which were using the graph database from Neo4j package, but it easily could be using request or GraphQL or any of the other ways that you can make calls out to a database. So if you can do it in Python, you can certainly do it in Streamlit. Let's see if we have another question. Adhish? Okay, great. Well, I know we're close to time, so if you have follow-up questions later, I'll certainly be in chat for a few minutes after this presentation. You have my contact information. I welcome you to contact me and look forward to some good conversations about graph in rapidly developing applications using Streamlit. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was amazing.
Thank you.